In the year 476, a boy was removed from a throne in Italy. He was about 16. His name was Romulus Augustulus, which is almost too neat because Romulus was the name of the man who supposedly founded Rome 1200 years earlier. The first Roman and the last Roman, same name. A Germanic commander named Odoacer took his crown, decided not to bother appointing a replacement, and sent the imperial regalia east. And that, you were probably taught, is the day the Roman Empire fell. Except almost nothing about that sentence is true. Nobody alive in 476 thought an empire had ended. The date was chosen centuries later. Half the empire didn't fall at all. It carried on for another 1,000 years. And when historians tried to count how many different explanations had been offered for the collapse, they got past 200, so let's do this properly. 1,200 years, start to finish. How a nothing little town on a river became the thing every empire since has tried to copy, and what actually happened to it. Chapter 1. A nothing town. Start in the 8th century BC and lower your expectations. Rome begins as a cluster of huts on some hills beside a river in central Italy. It is not the biggest settlement in the region. It is not the richest. Its neighbors, the Etruscans, are more sophisticated in almost every way. The Romans themselves said the city was founded in 753 BC by a man named Romulus, who had been raised by a wolf and who murdered his twin brother in an argument about where to build. That story is a legend. I want to be clear about that because it gets repeated as history. There was no wolf. There is no evidence for Romulus. What the archaeology shows is unglamorous and much more ordinary, people living on those hills for centuries, gradually merging into one town. But hold on to the legend anyway, because a civilization's founding myth tells you what it wants to believe about itself. And Rome chose a story about an abandoned child raised by a predator who killed his own brother to build a wall. They were telling you, from the beginning, exactly what they thought it took. Chapter 2. They kill the king. For its first 2.5 centuries, Rome has kings. Then, around 509 BC, it stops having them, violently. The tradition says the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was so tyrannical and one outrage by his son so unforgivable that the leading families threw the whole institution out. How much of that is true is anyone's guess. What matters is what came next and what it did to the Roman mind. They replaced the king with a system built entirely around making sure no one person could ever hold that much power again. 2 consuls instead of 1 king, each able to veto the other. 1 year in office, then out. A senate of former office holders as the permanent memory of the state. Popular assemblies. Tribunes whose whole job was to block things on behalf of ordinary citizens. This is the Roman Republic, and I need to correct something. It was not a democracy. Wealth and birth decided whose vote counted for how much, and a small circle of families held the top offices for centuries. It was an oligarchy with popular pressure valves. But the fear was real, and it lasted. For the next 500 years, the worst thing you could call a Roman politician was someone who wanted to be king. Remember that. It's going to kill several of the most important men in this story. Chapter 3. The War That Made Them. Rome spends the next 2 centuries doing something unspectacular and enormously consequential, beating its neighbors and then absorbing them. That second part is the trick. Most ancient conquerors took your city, took your things, and left you hating them. Rome took your city and then eventually offered your grandchildren the chance to be Roman. Not out of kindness. It was the most effective recruitment system in the ancient world. Every conquest widened the pool of people who would fight for Rome. By 264 BC, they control Italy, and then they run into Carthage. Carthage is a North African maritime power, richer than Rome, with a far better navy and a trading empire across the western Mediterranean. The two of them fight 3 wars over more than a century. The second is the one everyone remembers, because Hannibal marches an army, with elephants, over the Alps into Italy, and proceeds to destroy Roman armies repeatedly for 15 years. At Cannae, he encircles and annihilates a force that may have numbered 50,000 or more. It should have ended Rome. It didn't. because Rome simply refused to accept it had lost, raised new armies, and outlasted him. By 146 BC, Carthage is destroyed, and Rome is the dominant power in the Mediterranean. And this is the hinge of the entire story, because winning that big broke the thing that won. Chapter 4. Winning breaks it. Here is the problem with conquering the known world using a system designed for a medium-sized Italian town. The wealth is astronomical, and it flows to the few. Enormous estates, worked by enormous numbers of enslaved people captured in the wars, push small farmers off the land. Those farmers were the backbone of the army. Now they're landless and in the city and angry. I'm going to say the uncomfortable part plainly because it usually gets skipped. Rome ran on slavery, not incidentally, structurally, the estates, the mines, the households, the building projects. The prosperity everyone admires was built on the mass ownership of human beings, most of them taken in the wars we've just been describing. That is not a footnote to Roman greatness. It is the foundation of it. Meanwhile, the army changes, soldiers start serving longer under the same commander and looking to him, not the Senate, for their land and their pay. Which means that for the first time, a Roman general has a private army. What follows is a century of escalating political violence. Reformers murdered in the street, Marius and Sulla turning their armies on Rome itself, Sulla marching on the city, taking it and publishing lists of citizens who could be legally killed. And then Julius Caesar. Caesar conquers Gaul, becomes the most popular and most dangerous man alive, crosses a small river called the Rubicon with his army, which was illegal, wins the civil war that follows, and has himself made dictator for life. One correction, because this one is everywhere. Caesar was never emperor. There was no such office yet. He was a dictator, which was a real republican position, and he simply refused to stop being it. In 44 BC, senators stab him to death in a public meeting. They believed they were saving the republic from a king. They had in fact just ended it. Chapter 5. The Man Who Kept the Forms. Caesar's assassination triggers 13 more years of civil war, which ends at a naval battle called Actium in 31 BC. The winner is Caesar's adopted heir, a young man named Octavian, and Octavian is the cleverest man in this entire story, because he had watched his adoptive father get stabbed for looking like a king. So he took absolute power and dressed it as a restoration. He kept the Senate, he kept the consuls, the elections, the assemblies, the titles. Every republican form stayed exactly where it was. He simply held enough of the individual powers, simultaneously and permanently, that nothing could happen without him. He didn't call himself king. He called himself princeps, first citizen. And Augustus, a word suggesting something closer to revered. The Senate met. Elections happened. Rome told itself it was still a republic. It was a monarchy, and everybody knew, and the arrangement held for 200 years precisely because nobody had to say so out loud. That's the founding trick of the Roman Empire. Not conquest, not legions, paperwork, and a very carefully chosen word. Chapter 6. The Good Centuries. What follows is the bit everybody pictures. Roughly 200 years, usually called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The empire reaches its greatest extent under Trajan, Britain to Mesopotamia, the Rhine to the Sahara. Roads, aqueducts, law, baths, cities, trade moving safely across an entire sea that Rome could accurately call our sea. It is a genuine achievement, and it is worth being honest about what it cost and what it was. The peace was real for the people inside it and enforced by extraordinary violence at its edges. And it was never peaceful for the enslaved, who kept the whole thing running. The emperors themselves are a mixed bag, ranging from the genuinely capable to the outright deranged. Some of the famous horror stories are exaggerated by hostile sources written decades later. Roman historians had agendas, and the previous dynasty was monstrous was a useful thing to write under the current one. But the structural problem never gets solved. There is no rule for who becomes emperor next. Not really. It's some unstable mix of inheritance, adoption, Senate approval, and increasingly, whichever man the army likes. For 2 centuries, that's manageable. And then it isn't. Chapter 7. The century it nearly ended. The 3rd century almost finishes Rome 200 years early. Between roughly 235 and 284 AD, the empire has somewhere around 26 emperors, and most of them are murdered. Generals declare themselves emperor, march on rivals, and get killed by their own troops. Whole regions break away and run themselves. The currency is debased until it's nearly worthless. Plague moves through the population. Pressure builds on every frontier at once. Historians call this the crisis of the 3rd century, which is a very calm name for 50 years of an empire coming apart. And then, genuinely remarkably, it doesn't. An emperor called Diocletian pulls it back together, and he does it by admitting the obvious. The thing is too big for one man. So he splits the administration, sharing power between multiple rulers, covering different halves. It works. It also plants the division that everything after depends on. Then Constantine does the other enormous thing. He converts to Christianity, backs it with imperial power, and builds a new capital in the east, Constantinople. Within a century, a persecuted sect becomes the religion of the empire. Gibbon, the most famous historian of Rome's fall, would later argue this was a major cause of the collapse, that Christianity drained Rome's martial spirit. Modern historians treat that as one reading among many, and a reading that says as much about Gibbon's own century as about Rome's. Hold that thought too. We're nearly at the part where the tidy story falls apart. Chapter 8. The Western half stops. The 4th and 5th centuries in the West are a long, uneven decline that contemporaries did not experience as a decline. They experienced it as a series of specific problems, most of which had happened before. Groups from beyond the frontier move in, some invading, many invited, many serving in the Roman army for generations. The word usually used is barbarians, which is a Roman insult meaning roughly people who don't speak Greek or Latin, and it flattens an enormous variety of peoples into one lump. Many of them wanted in, not down. They wanted to be Roman. Rome is sacked in 410. For the first time in 800 years. The shock across the Mediterranean is enormous, and yet the empire keeps going for another 66 years. The Western government gets steadily weaker, poorer, and more dependent on generals it can't control. Territory is lost. Tax revenue collapses, which means the army shrinks, which means more territory is lost. And in 476, Odoacer deposes a teenager and doesn't appoint another one. That's it. That's the fall of Rome. A boy sent into retirement and a vacancy nobody filled. Chapter 9. The part you weren't told. Now, 2 things about that date. The first, the eastern half didn't fall. At all. The empire governed from Constantinople carried on. Roman law, Roman administration, an unbroken line of emperors for another 1,000 years. It only ended in 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans. We call that Eastern Empire Byzantine. They never did. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans, right to the end. Byzantine is a label historians applied centuries later, and it quietly performs a trick. It lets us say Rome fell in 476, while an empire calling itself Roman was still standing, still governing, for the next millennium. The second, 476, was chosen, not observed. Nobody wrote in 476 that the Roman Empire had ended. There was no announcement. For people living through it, an emperor had been removed, which had happened constantly for 200 years, and the Eastern Emperor was still very much there. The date was picked out later by historians who needed a line. So why did Rome fall? In 1984, a German historian named Alexander Demant went through the literature and counted the distinct explanations that had been proposed. He found more than 200. Christianity, lead poisoning, barbarians, taxation, slavery, moral decay, climate change, plague, currency debasement, overexpansion, soil exhaustion, 200 of them. And a serious body of historians argues the premise is wrong, that Rome didn't fall so much as transform, gradually and often violently, into the medieval world. The road stayed. The language became French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian. The law underpins half the legal systems on earth. The church kept the administrative structure and the Latin. Here's what I think the 1200 years actually show you. Rome never had a plan. Not once, at any point in this story, did anyone design it. They threw out a king out of rage and improvised a republic. They beat Carthage and accidentally acquired an empire their institutions couldn't govern. Augustus improvised a monarchy that pretended to be a republic. Diocletian improvised a split because the job was impossible. Constantine improvised a new capital and a new religion. Every stage was somebody patching the previous stage. And that is why it's so hard to say when it fell. A thing that was improvised for 1200 years doesn't have a clean ending. It has a long, uneven fading in the west and a straight continuation in the east that we've agreed to call by another name. So did Rome fall in 476? A boy lost a throne he barely held in an empire that had been shrinking for a century, while the other half of that same empire carried on for another 1,000 years without interruption. Rome didn't end in 476. It's just that at some point somebody had to write a date down, and we've been repeating it ever since.